First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Bracha Kodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Romans, the first chapter. And the book of Romans, which is a letter that a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the believers at Rome. Okay, because prior to him actually visiting Rome, which at the time he wrote this letter, he was in Corinth, right? This was during his third missionary journey. And so as he had made his way all the way to Achaia and he was at Corinth, he wrote the letter of Romans to them. And you already had some believers that were there, right? So there was a church that was already established there in Rome because you already had Israelites there. And now the exact who established it or the details of how the church or the body of believers at Rome, came to be is not detailed, or outlined in detail here. But, you can infer, right, with the way the word was spreading. Either you had some apostles that were sent all the way there, okay, prior to the Apostle Paul. But you also have, going back to the book of Acts, the second chapter, let's pull that up, at the Feast of Pentecost, when the Lord has sent the Holy Spirit upon the apostles, and they spoke with different tongues. Remember that you had individuals from all different parts, devout men, Jews, right, that came to Jerusalem, and they heard this. Not only did they hear the disciples speak in their own language, the apostles, they also were cut, right? So when you jump down to Acts 2 and 10, listing the areas where these Israelites that came to Jerusalem were from, where they were dwelling. It has here Phrygia, Pamphylia, in Egypt, and in the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome. Okay, so you had Israelites that were in Rome, which we'll read a little bit about that, that knew they were Israelites, okay, Jews, they had synagogues and everything, and they had come here to Jerusalem to keep this holy day. Jews and proselytes. Now, they heard, right, what Peter, they heard the speaking of the different languages, the spirit of being able to speak in different tongues. And after Peter had spoken to them, right, let me go all the way down here. This was the reaction that they had, right, in verse 37. Now, when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart, so they were convicted, and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? Then Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, for the remission of sins, that ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. So they, keep in mind that these individuals here, you had some that were from Rome, right, that believed, that heard this, and took that word back. All right. So long story short, you already had, a church or some believers here in Rome at the time Paul was writing this book of Romans here. And I believe that you also had Priscilla and Aquila back. Basically, they were, back in Rome at this time, because I believe he includes them in his salutations there. Because Priscilla and Aquila, they were originally dwelling in Rome, but under Claudius, the Jews were expelled, so they were kicked out. That's when Paul met them on I forget which journey it was he was on, but he met them. And so they stayed, with him. They stayed in Asia for a while, but after Claudius was out of there, they were allowed to go back, right? That ban was lifted. So likely how they ended up going back there. Anyway, let's read this here. This is the origins of the church at Rome. And I'll read just a little bit of this, but it has some pretty good information here that we can get into. It says, when Paul wrote his letter to the Christians at Rome towards the end of his third missionary journey, He was communicating with what appears to be a firmly established collection of believers in that city. This article tackles a question that primary extant sources do not specifically address. How did that collection of believers in Rome come into existence? The earliest available sources leave only indirect clues towards solving this puzzle. And then it gives basically just a little overview of what this is going to be about. But we're going to read certain portions here, not the whole entire thing. So first, it gives you a bit of background about Jews in Rome prior to the origin of the church, right, of the believers there, how they got there, what was the situation like over there. So it says here, sources indicate that before Christians emerged in Rome, Jews had already established a presence in the city. Now, keep in mind that these Christians and the Jews, they were still all of the same stock. Right? They were all still Israelites, but there was a difference in understanding of the truth. All right, the Jews held fast, a lot of them, to their traditions, right, to the law of Moses, refusing to open up their minds to follow the ways of Yahushua as the Christians did. So it says here, inscriptions from Jewish catacombs and comments from literary documents open a window into the life, organization, and struggles of the Jews in Rome. Now, a catacomb, let's type that in here. Let's see. Catacomb. Let's see. Of. All right, so it says here, the Jewish catacombs in Rome are ancient underground burial sites from the 2nd to 5th centuries CE, used by the Jewish community during the late Roman Empire. Let me see if it tells us a bit more in here, but basically the author is saying, based on the things that they kind of like graffiti or written or wrote there, they could get a sense of what were some, what was life like, back then. Jewish Roma can take you underground the Jewish catacombs down a staircase of 7 steps to walk along the 400-meter long cubicola. Right, it says here, you will be taken back to 22 centuries ago when Jews moved to Rome and needed a land to bury their people. Through these findings, we can discover and understand the life of the first Jews in Rome, their cultural practices, and their social organization. So let's go back here. The catacomb inscriptions have most recently been dated from the late 2nd century or the late 2nd through the 5th centuries AD. Richardson concludes that the inscriptions attest to the existence of at least 5 synagogues in Rome in the early 1st century, with the possibility of even more. The Hebrew synagogue probably arose first, with subsequent synagogues named after famous allies of the Jews. The language used in inscriptions suggests that many of these synagogues were in the poorer sects of the city. Scholars have noted the lack of evidence for a central organization or leadership structure that oversaw different synagogues. So in Jerusalem, you had, your high priest, right, the chief scribes and Pharisees. You had the court, otherwise known as the Sanhedrin, the greater and the lesser in the different areas. So there was an organized structure, right, as it says here, that would oversee the different synagogues and the Jews where they were, but it didn't seem to be the case here in Rome, at least per this information that we're reading. At the same time, in the inscriptions, only leaders are identified in relation to their synagogues. Ordinary Jews affiliated themselves with Judaism as a whole rather than their particular synagogue. Thus, the Jews viewed themselves as a unified group despite the apparent lack of a controlling body of spiritual leaders in the city. Literary excerpts describe the social and political environment of the Roman Jews. For instance, as early as 59 BC, Cicero offers his opinion on the Jews during his defense of Flaccus. You know what a big crowd it is, how they stick together, how influential they are in informal assemblies. Every year it was customary to send gold to Jerusalem on the order of the Jews from Italy and from all our provinces. Cicero's remarks confirm the presence of a large community of Jews in Rome and indicate misgivings about their separatist tendencies. Comments by Philo about events under the reign of Augustus provide further information. So these are sources, right? Extra biblical sources by different, authors at the time that were speaking on the Jews that were in Rome. So he says here, the great section of Rome on the other side of the Tiber is occupied and inhabited by Jews, most of whom were Roman citizens emancipated. For having been brought as captives to Italy, they were liberated by their owners and were not forced to violate any of their native institutions. So some of them were brought, as slaves when Pompey went and took over uh, the land of Israel, right, and officially made it a province, the province of Judea, and eventually those that were brought as slaves became free, and they were allowed, as it says, were not forced to violate any of their native institutions, so they were allowed to practice, right, keep our customs and so on, in the land. They have houses of prayer and meet together in them, particularly on the sacred Sabbaths, when they receive as a body of training in their ancestral philosophy. They collect money for sacred purposes from their first fruits and send them to Jerusalem by persons who would offer the sacrifices. See, so and the scriptures talk about that, right? Like, when you have your first fruits, or whatever you're going to offer to the Lord, if you can't take it all the way, you can't travel with it, you can convert it to money. Like Cicero, Philo notes, or Philo notes that the Jews maintained a distinct identity. The section of Rome Philo mentions, Trastevere was the chief foreign quarter of the city, a district characterized by narrow, crowded streets, towering tenement houses teeming with population. Philo also refers to the reason some of the Jews now lived in Rome. Their ancestors had been forcibly taken to Rome as slaves under Pompey. Once freed, the Jews bore the title Libertini, or freedmen, like loosely, from there. Just as seen from Philo, the Jews were, hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right, were permitted to freely engage in Jewish practice under the favorable policy of Augustus. Things changed under the Emperor Tiberius. Tacitus reports that Tiberius took action against the Jews in 19 AD. Another debate dealt with the proscription of the Egyptian and Jewish rites, and a senatorial edict directed that 4,000 descendants of enfranchised slaves, tainted with that superstition and suitable in point of age, were to be shipped to Sardinia and there be employed in suppressing brigandage. The rest had orders to leave Italy unless they had renounced their impious ceremonial by a given date. So Tiberius, these were things he was doing. Now we know it was during the reign of Tiberius that Yahushua was put to death. Tacitus thus adds another witness that many Roman Jews were freed slaves. He also labels their beliefs as a superstition, alluding to the scorn Jews endured as a result of their special religious practices. Most important, the record of Tiberius's move against the Jewish population stands as the first of several actions against the Roman Jews in the first century. Let's see what else we have here. All right, it says here, the pre-Christian sources about Jews in Rome are valuable in two ways. First, they provide a glimpse at the Jewish environment from which Christianity likely emerged. So you get a sense of what it was like before, those that believed, or the establishment of the believers there in Rome. Jews maintained their distinct identity and practices through participation in synagogues that were found mostly in poorer districts of the city. They encountered suspicion from outside observers and occasional unwelcome intervention by the government. Second, the Jewish sources help us to understand later important texts more accurately. The lack of central oversight by Jewish religious authorities, the presence of separate synagogues throughout the city, the existence of a group of libertini, and the government's policy towards the Jews all set the stage for interpreting later texts related to Christianity's emergence in Rome. So I'm going to stop that part right there just to give a bit of background. And now we can go into the book of Romans, the first chapter. So you'll notice as Paul writes, in his speech, you can tell that he's saying like there are already some believers in Rome at this time, but Paul hasn't been to Rome yet. So this is Romans chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a servant of Yahushua HaMashiach, called to be an apostle, separated onto the gospel of God. And the word separated there goes into he's appointed, okay, or chosen out to be an apostle of God, right? So it says here, in a good sense, to appoint, to set apart for some purpose. And that's what the Lord told Ananias, right, when he went to heal Paul. So he says here, separated or appointed unto the gospel of God, which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, right? That through he has showed the prophets basically this gospel that would be preached, or the effects of it in future time, and that is the same gospel that Paul has been appointed to preach concerning his son, Yahushua HaMashiach, our Lord, because that's what the gospel is really about, Yahushua, which was made of the seed of David according to the flesh. So Yahushua was a descendant of David through the flesh, meaning David's son, all the way down to Joseph, and then Joseph to Yahushua. So the seed of David, or his lineage, according to the flesh, means exactly that. So Joseph would have had to plant his seed in Mary, and then that seed, which is of the line of David, would come forth born as Yahushua, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. So it was made clear that this Yahushua was the Son of God, or is the Son of God, according to the Spirit of holiness, which was, this declaration was showed forth by the resurrection from the dead. So by the Lord resurrecting Yahushua from the dead, that sealed and proved ultimately without a doubt that this man, Yahushua Mashiach, that was on the earth, was truly the Son of God, by whom we have received grace and apostleship. And when you go into that word grace, it says here, charis, goodwill, right? Loving kindness, of the merciful kindness by which God, exerting his holy influence upon souls, turns them to Mashiach. So that grace is a spirit of mercy and kindness the Lord puts upon said individuals to open up their minds, to turn them to believe in Yahushua. And that process is an act of great mercy and kindness, because that gives them a way or an avenue to be delivered. And it is so because not everybody was able to receive that. Keeps, strengthens, increases them in Christian faith, knowledge, affection, and kindles them to the exercise of Christian virtues. So not only does it turn them to believe in the Lord, but it strengthens them through the grace of the Lord, of the Heavenly Father, to continue in the faith of Yahweh Shai. An apostleship, right, which is basically what the appointed position that Paul was in to go and preach the gospel of Yahweh Shai. For obedience to the faith among all nations for his name, right? So they were set up, he was put in this position, and the grace and apostleship was given so that the Israelites that were amongst all the different nations that were of the elect would hear this word, and some, when I say some here, referring to those that are of the elect, would be obedient, would obey, all right, for the name of the Lord. Among whom are ye also called of Yahweh Shai HaMashiach? See, so here he's letting you know that you have some Israelites here at Rome already that were called of Yahweh Shai. They were believers. To all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Yahweh Shai HaMashiach. First, I thank my God through Yahweh Shai HaMashiach for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. So he's saying, I'm grateful to the Lord because your faith, being so strong is basically commendable, right? Spoken of throughout the world. We've all heard of it. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers. So as he was saying, I'm always praying for you believers over there in Rome, because I know that it's not easy. You're literally in the, like the main city of this Roman Empire. So it's not an easy thing, but, you're continuing to hold on strong. Making request, if by any means now at length, which is another way of saying like finally or now at last, I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come on to you. So he's saying, I pray for you, and I also beseech the Lord that, at last I can make my way over to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift, to the end ye may be established. And Paul wanted to go there and, see what parts they needed growth on and to strengthen their faith, okay? Which would be him imparting onto them that spiritual gift would be, and mainly in strengthening their faith, because that faith is a gift from the Lord, okay? But so as you've been given a certain level, you can always increase, through the edification and exhortation, and really through the continuing to serve the Lord, right? You'll go through certain experiences, you'll learn certain things, and that'll strengthen you. As he says, to the end that ye may be established. That is, he expounds, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. So he wanted to go there and comfort them, together in the faith that they both believed in. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto. So he's saying, there were many times when I intended to come and visit you, but was let. Let is Old English for he was prevented or he was withheld. When you read in the book of 2 Thessalonians, when he refers to the man of sin and he says only he who now letteth will let, he's referring to the revelation of the man of sin being held back, right? So that word let there is not how we think of let, like, let me let you do something. So it says here to hinder, prevent, forbid, to withhold a thing from anyone, to deny or refuse a thing. So he's saying, I wanted to come on to you, but I was prevented up until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. And these Gentiles were Israelite foreigners. So he was saying that I wanted to come unto you that I may also teach some of you and gain some fruit amongst you that are in Rome, as I have amongst the other Israelite foreigners in these different areas, right? These different churches that he had established. I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. And the reason he said he is a debtor is because he was a servant. So he owes it to them to go wherever they are and to preach that gospel, because this was the dispensation that was put upon him, as Yahushua told him that he would have to go there and bear his name. So that was his task. That was his duty. Now, the word barbarians here, it can mean in the first sense, right? One who is whose speech is rude, rough and harsh, but more likely in the third sense, used by the Greeks of any foreigner ignorant of the Greek language, whether mental or moral, with the added notion after the Persian War of rudeness and brutality. The word is used in the New Testament without the idea of reproachfulness. So barbarians used in the New Testament does not always mean one that is like, it's not meant to be used in a reproachful sense, but more so in the sense of maybe one that did not speak Greek or wasn't, I'm not going to say privy, but they just weren't entrenched in the, in the norm, right? The common language which of the world at this time was Greek. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. So he's saying, I'm ready, right? As much as as I have, I'm ready to come and preach the gospel to you there as well. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Hamashiach, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. See, so he's saying, I have no reason to be ashamed of this gospel. It is through this gospel. This gospel shows the power of God to bring salvation to all that believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, right? So to those of the circumcision, right, that knew they were Israelites, that kept the customs, that kept the laws of Moses, but to the believers amongst them, and also to the Greek, because the word did come first to the Jews, those that knew they were Israelites. But as he mentioned, he expounds on in Romans, the 11th chapter, that it came to them, and blindness in part also came to them. So some were not going to believe, so that the door could be opened for the Israelite foreigners, here known as the Greek, so that they would get the opportunity to hear the word and then believe as well. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So in this gospel being preached in order to bring salvation to everyone that believes, both to the Jew and to the Greek, that shows the righteousness of God. That reveals the righteousness of God, as it says, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. See, and it is through faith that we would gain salvation, that we would be justified, we would be made righteous, and we would gain that life eternal, not of works. So in the NLT, it says, this good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and righteousness of men. Right, because it is when ungodliness and unrighteousness is pushed forth that triggers the wrath of the Lord, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, what Paul is going to use here, or what he is using here in majority of his writing here in Romans, is something known as a Christian diatribe, right? And a diatribe diatribe speech is when you speak, and I'll pull it up in a second, but when you speak as though you're speaking against some hypothetical opponent, anticipating what they'll say and sort of rebuttaling that and refuting that to make a point. So it's not like he's particularly singling out somebody specifically, in Rome, but in order to convey the points and fully address them, sometimes it sounds like he's speaking to somebody, right, or against somebody there, but that's a part of that kind of speech. So let's pull that up here. Diatribe. All right. Okay. So it says here, a diatribe, also known less formally as rant, is a lengthy oration, though often reduced to writing, made in criticism of someone or something, often employing humor, sarcasm, and appeals to emotion. Now let's go specifically to here we go. Diatribes in religious speech. Says here, Stuart Sykes proposes that there is a difference between pagan diatribes, which he suggests are directed against a present individual, and Christian diatribes, which he suggests are directed against a hypothetical other person, but more fully intended to persuade the reader or listener. A noted historical example of a religious diatribe can be found in Paul's epistle to the Romans. With respect to that usage, a diatribe is described as an oration in which the speaker seeks to persuade an audience by debating an imaginary opponent, typically using second person singular. The speaker raises hypothetical questions and responds to them, or states false conclusions and goes on to refute them. So it's like this almost like this light imaginary back and forth, but it's to prove a point. So let me give you an example of what this is referring to. Let's say we go here to the book of Romans, the 9th chapter. And let's see. Yeah. So in Romans 9 and 17 on down, Paul is speaking about the righteousness of the Lord, right? And then he also mentions that the Lord's will is absolute. Nobody is able to, resist the Lord's will, but he has mercy on who he will have mercy on, right? He says that in Romans 9 and 17 and then 18. So I'm going to read 18 and 19 and then 20. And so he says here, therefore he hath mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will he hardeneth. This is the Most High. Thou wilt say then unto me, why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? So here's an example of him using Christian diatribe. He's not saying that there's a particular individual in the Church of Rome responding this way to him. This is the, hypothetical opponent, the anticipated response that a typical individual would give. And he includes that in here so that he can, rebuttal that. He can, counter that. So this thou isn't an actual person, like specifically, but it's to represent an opposing opinion or even a question that somebody might raise in response to what he's saying. So he throws that in there so he can then, verse 20, nay, but O man, who art thou that replies against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? So this here is an example where he's, using, because even when we speak, sometimes we use that, right? We'll say like people, right? We'll say something, we'll say, yeah, but people will turn around and say, oh, you guys are always this or you guys are always that. And there are certain people that have said that, but we may not be referring to anybody in particular. Sometimes when you're speaking, you'll say, hey, a brother might say this, or, a brother might be hurt by this, but you're not speaking about anybody in particular. You're using a form of diatribe to make your point more clear as you're addressing an audience. So I just wanted to highlight that real quick. It might make a bit more sense as you're reading the book of Romans to understand this concept that Paul is using here, a bit better. So it's not like 1st and 2nd Corinthians where he is directly addressing actionable things or things that he has heard and specific individuals in the things that they've done, right? This is a bit different here in Romans. So, continuing on in Romans chapter 1, verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shewed it unto them. Now, let's read this here in the NLT. It says, let me actually go up a verse. But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So Paul's saying here, the Lord has made it clear to you, right? His power and the things that he requires of you. Right? It says, for ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart or minds were darkened. Because how did they not glorify him when they knew him? They gave his glory to another. Rather than praising the Lord, they would give that glory to idols. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So in thinking that they were, wise in their own conceits, thinking they had discovered this new wisdom and worshiping stones and the sun and the moon and this God and that God, they were actually becoming more and more foolish, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image, which is an idol, made like to corruptible man. See, so the glory that should be attributed to the Lord, the incorruptible God, for his creations, this is why it says their hearts were darkened and they became foolish. They rather took that and attributed it to an idol that was made like to a corruptible man, a perishable idol. And like whether it's in the form or figure of a man, or as he says here, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So you have certain people, they'll carve an idol that looks like a bird. They'll carve an idol that looks like a bull. They'll carve an idol that looks like a bug. They'll carve an idol that looks like a man. All right, it has a face, arms, and all of that. And they give the glory of God to it. They'll say, this is the sun god. This is the god or goddess of fertility. This is the god of fortune. And so even though the Most High is the one who causes the sun to shine, who gives rain, who opens up the womb, they attribute that to these idols. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own heart. So as a result, since this is what they wanted to do, the Lord gave them up to it. He let that spirit run wild. He allowed those demons, those perverse demons, to invade the minds of the people. As it says, through the lusts of their own hearts, because that's what they desired, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. So they were, as it says, dishonoring. They were doing things unbecoming against nature with their bodies amongst each other. Who changed the truth of God. He revisits this point right later on. Who changed the truth of God into a lie. And the word change is they exchanged. So rather than believing the actual truth concerning the Lord and how to serve him, they exchanged that to rather believe a lie, which is the worshiping of idols, okay, and the going astray into the perverseness of the world, and worshipped and served the creature more than the creator. Because in that lie of thinking that the creature or the creation has power, they neglected the actual authority and power of the Creator himself, who is blessed forever. Amen. The Creator. For this cause, so because of this, God gave them up unto vile affections. So you have some individuals that desire to go astray. They desire to go into this kind of wicked practice, and the Lord then at some point just said, okay, He just took away any good conscience from them, anything that would prevent them and make them think twice, and just allow their minds to be overrun in their lusts. So they were driven by it. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. So the natural use of a woman sleeping with a man, having children, they did that which is against nature. Women with women. Today you call that lesbians. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman. The natural use of the woman with a man is a man sleeping with a woman. That's her. The woman's body is literally designed for a man, and vice versa. That's why she has a hole and he has a key or a rod that goes there. And when you lay with a woman, her body literally reacts. The things you do triggers natural reactions in her body. And usually the body is designed that when something is not good, it doesn't necessarily feel good. When something is wrong, you feel pain or you feel uneasy. And there's the reverse. Okay. So here, the natural use of a woman, we all know what that is. But as Paul is saying here, the men being given up to vile affections left the natural use of the woman and instead burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, partaking in that which is unbecoming. That is Moism, all right? Men laying with men, having intercourse with men. That's what Paul's referring to here. And receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. So as a result, they got judged for it. And to put it plainly, I'll just read it in the NLT as well. Both verses, actually. So in verse 26, it says, "That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other." NLT, the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. Men did shameful things with other men. And as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, so because they didn't want to, as it says, they changed the glory of the Lord or the truth of the Lord into a lie. God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. See? So he basically, like it says, he gave up their minds to it. And they were fully driven in that, nothing holding them back. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, right? Immoral, physical and spiritual, right? Immoral sexual activity in the physical sense. And spiritual fornication is idolatry, or the worshiping of other gods, which is really idolatry because there's only one true living God. Wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers. Let's look into that word malignity over there. Sure, we understand most of these other words and what they mean. It says here, bad character, depravity of heart and life, mischievousness, malicious craftiness. So today you would say they were just straight demons. Whisperers, all right, gossipers, backbiters, haters of God. Let's look into that word, backbiters. And these are all the traits of one who was wholly given up to a reprobate mind. A defamer, an evil speaker. Okay, talkative, slanderer. That's your backbiters. Haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, both in the physical and their spiritual parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. Implacable meaning you can't reason with them, right? You can't come to an agreement with them. Without natural affection, they don't have that. They're just like, their minds are just not normal. Okay, they don't feel the things a normal person would. Empathy, sympathy, just nah. Unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So they, being fully aware of the judgment of the Lord, they still continue to do it and take pleasure in in those of them that do it as well. And that brings us to the end of the book of Romans, the first chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Racha Kodesh. And until next time, Shalom.